Thank you. You may be seated.
You probably have all recalled the story in the Gospels of the beginning of the end of Holy Week, where Jesus has celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples and has moved to the Garden of Gethsemane up on the Mount of Olives. You can see on this map some of the landmarks that we're going to be covering tonight. That graphic looking straight down may be a little tougher to imagine than this one looking at an angle. We have the Temple Mount up on the right side, and just to the right of that is the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a short distance that was traveled. We're going to trace Christ's footsteps. After Jesus and his disciples had observed that Passover meal in the upper room in southwest Jerusalem, they traveled to the Mount of Olives, northeast of the city, and on to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's likely, since Jesus was born around 4 or 6 BC, he died in 30 AD. During the Passover in the year 30 AD, that Last Supper would have been observed on Thursday. Jesus would therefore have been crucified on Friday, April 7, and it's at nearby Gethsemane, where Jesus, apparently knowing that the time of his death was very near, suffered great mental anguish, and as described by the physician Luke, we're told that his sweat became like blood. And although that's a very rare phenomenon, bloody sweat, a condition known as hematidrosis, can occur in severe states of emotional stress, and it results in hemorrhaging of blood into the sweat glands. The skin becomes very fragile and tender. Luke's description supports this diagnosis of hematidrosis. And although some authors have said Jesus may have lost a lot of blood during that process, it was probably very little, actually, in looking at other cases in our modern day where we've seen this phenomenon occur. There is examples of this. People experiencing air raids in World War I were in a state of utter emotional shock and were bleeding sweat. There's been cases of people in the WW2 death camps bleeding sweat. So this is a real phenomenon, most likely what we're seeing described to us here by Luke. We recall Jesus being arrested in the garden and taken. And Jesus, keep in mind, his trials, the next stage in the end of Holy Week, consisted of Jewish or religious trials as well as civil trials that were put on by the Romans. First, the Jewish trials. We know soon after midnight, Jesus was arrested at Gethsemane. He was taken first to the house of Annas and then to his son-in-law Caiaphas, the ruling Jewish high priest for the year. Sometime between 1 a.m. and daybreak, Jesus was tried, if you want to call it that, before Caiaphas, and he was found guilty of blasphemy. It's important to note that Jesus' trial was unjust. It was illegal, even according to every principle of jurisprudence at the time. Criminal trials were not to be held at night, and yet that's when the Jewish authorities found it convenient to take Christ. Capital cases, those that would result in a death penalty, could only be held at the temple, and yet Christ was dragged to the house of Caiaphas where this was done. Witnesses were necessary in such a case. We read in the Gospels they had trouble finding witnesses, and then even when they found witnesses, they couldn't agree to the same story. So this trial was a sham from the very beginning. The guards, we know, after Jesus was then convicted of blasphemy, the guards begin to mock Jesus. We read about him being spat on, being beaten. For a Jew to spit in another's face was one of the grossest and most hateful forms of personal insult. And yet Luke 22 records, they blindfolded him, they spat on him, they kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? So you imagine that picture of Christ being blindfolded and being bitten, being beaten, and being asked, who was it that hit you? Soon after daybreak, presumably now moving to the temple, knowing that they probably would get in trouble if they continued this trial hidden away, Jesus was then tried before the Sanhedrin and again found guilty of blasphemy, a crime that was punishable by death. But the Jews could not carry out that sentence. This is where the Romans came in. The Roman trials. Again, since permission for an execution had to come from the governing Romans, Jesus was taken early in that morning by the temple officials to the Praetorium, the residence and governmental seat of Pontius Pilate. You may recognize that picture in the upper left. Anybody recognize that classic painting? Anybody know the name of it? That's Pilate with his hand out, saying, behold the man. Ecce homo is the painting, done by Antonio Cesare in 1871. So the Jewish leaders knew that Pilate would not want to be involved in this. It was a religious dispute, after all. So they presented Jesus to Pilate, not as a blasphemer, but rather as a self-appointed king who would undermine the Roman authority. Pilate, seeking to extricate himself from what he considered to be nothing more than a religious disagreement, thought that Jesus, being from Galilee, was actually under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. So conveniently, Herod happened to be in town for Passover, and Pilate did what any politician would do. He passed the buck, and he sends Jesus over to Herod. Herod's only interest, we're told in the Gospels, his only interest in Jesus was described as an idle curiosity. He had heard of the miracles that Jesus had done throughout Galilee. He was disappointed when Jesus refused to perform for him. We read in Luke 23 that Herod questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. Herod grew tired of Jesus, evidently, and decided to make sport of him. And Luke 23:11 says, then Herod, with his men of war, treated him, Christ, with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And again, Pilate could find no basis for a legal charge against Jesus. In fact, we read 3 separate times in John's gospel alone that Pilate pronounced his assessment of Jesus. And each time, we all know what his verdict was, wasn't it? Not guilty. Pontius Pilate even tried to please the crowd by following the Passover tradition of offering to release a prisoner for them. He would let the people choose between this political prisoner, Jesus, and a ruthless, condemned criminal, Barabbas. When given the choice, the crowd chanted to release Barabbas. They had worn down Pilate. They had finally gotten what they wanted. Pilate then said, what to do with this man Jesus? And again, we all know those phrases that came. The jeering from the crowd, and they're chanting, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate granted their demand, and he handed over Jesus to be scourged and to be crucified. Just a note on the health of Jesus. Given the extent of his ministry, the amount of walking that he did through Palestine, it's reasonable for us to assume that he was in good physical condition before this all started. However, during these 12 hours between 9 at night on Thursday, when he was arrested, and 9 in the morning on Friday, Jesus had suffered great emotional stress, already evidenced by his bleeding sweat. He had suffered the abandonment by his closest friends, the disciples, who remember scattered like cockroaches upon Jesus being arrested. And he had already suffered one physical beating. Also, in the setting of a traumatic and a sleepless night, on that figure I showed you earlier, remember all the traveling. He was walking back and forth to these trials. He wasn't being put on a chariot and driven. It's estimated he walked about 2.5 miles just that night, back and forth to different trials. So these physical, these emotional factors, no doubt, rendered Jesus very vulnerable to the adverse effects that were about to be encountered with his scourging. Now, scourging is a term that we probably have heard of. Scourging or flogging was a legal preliminary event to all Roman executions, all crucifixions. And only women and Roman senators or soldiers, except those who deserted, were exempt. The usual instrument that was used for a scourging, you can see it on the left there. It's a short whip called a flagrum or a flagellum. It had several single or braided leather thongs of variable lengths in which were small iron bars or balls, or sharp pieces of sheep bones were tied along these strings at various intervals, sometimes metal fragments. And for the scourging, the man was stripped of his clothing, and his hands were tied to an upright post. The back, the buttocks, and the legs were then flogged, either by 2 soldiers called lictors, or sometimes one who alternated from the left to the right side. And the severity of the scourging usually depended solely on the disposition or mood of the lictors. And it was intended, keep in mind, this scourging, to weaken the victim to a state just short of death. After the scourging, of course, the soldiers would taunt their victims even further. At the praetorium, we are told, Jesus was severely scourged. Although the severity of the scourging is not laid out for us in Scripture, it is implied in one of the epistles in 1 Peter 2:24. We read that he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. And you know the rest of the passage. By his wounds you have been healed. A detailed word study of the ancient Greek text for that verse indicates that the scourging of Jesus was particularly harsh. It is not known whether the number of lashes was limited to the 39 that the Jews would typically limit to. After all, this wasn't the Jews doing this. This was the Romans, and they had their own rules. There's been documented cases historically of men who have been through scourging up to 100 lashes. So encouraged by the crowds, the blows continued as Christ is standing at the pole, cutting deeper and deeper into his tissues. Blood begins to ooze from the capillaries, from the veins of the skin, until finally arterial bleeding from the vessels in the underlying muscles is occurring. Blood is pouring out. Shreds of skin become detached, hanging in ribbons on the back. The entire area of Jesus' back has become an unrecognizable mass of torn flesh, deep grooves exposing a bloody mass of muscle, bone, and tissue. Remember, Isaiah 52 talks of Jesus' appearance being so marred, so disfigured, that it was beyond human semblance. Blood is flowing freely down his body, forming a deep red pool at his feet, Jesus' whole body would now be trembling, with shivers running down his spine as his strength begins to fail. His wrists being tied to the post is the only reason he's still upright, because his legs have now lost the strength to hold him. Finally, it is over, and Jesus is untied, and he collapses to the ground. Too weak to move, he lies there on the pavement, soaked in his own blood. The Roman soldiers, being amused that this weakened man had claimed to be a king, began to mock him once again, placing a robe on his shoulders, a sharp crown of thorns pressed into his head, and a wooden staff given to him to hold as a scepter. Next, they spat on Jesus again, struck him on the head with the wooden staff. The severe scourging, with its intense pain and appreciable blood loss, most probably left Jesus in what we would call a pre-shock state. The physical and mental abuse that had been meted out by the Jews and now the Romans, as well as the lack of food, lack of water, lack of sleep, also significantly contributed to his weakened state. Therefore, we could probably assume that even before the actual crucifixion, Jesus' physical condition was, at the very least, very serious, very likely bordering on critical. BC. Alexander the Great introduced the practice to Egypt, and Carthage and the Romans appear to have learned it from them. However, the Romans perfected crucifixion as a form of torture and capital punishment that was designed to produce a slow death with maximum pain and suffering. It was one of the most disgraceful and cruel methods of execution, and usually was reserved only for slaves, foreigners, revolutionaries, and for the vilest of criminals. The cross was characterized by an upright post called a stipes and a horizontal bar or a patibulum. And there were many variations. I've read different articles arguing one way or the other. Evidence seems to support that the low Tau cross, the one on the left bottom there, was the preferred one by the Romans in Palestine at the time of Christ. Now, it was customary for the condemned man to carry his own cross from the flogging post to the site of crucifixion outside the city walls. But since the cross weighed probably 250 to 300 pounds, usually only the crossbar was carried. The patibulum was placed across the nape of the neck, balanced on the shoulders, and then tied on both arms. Then the processional began. Mark 15 records that they brought him to the point of execution. The processional, led by a complete Roman military guard and headed by a centurion. Outside the city walls was permanently located the heavy upright wooden stipes on which the crossbar would then be secured. And in the case of that Tau cross, this was accomplished by a joint at the top, often to prolong the crucifixion process. A horizontal block or a plank, that crude seat you can see in the middle there, was placed. That would afford the victim a place to sit down onto. Only very rarely, and probably after the time of Christ, was an additional block employed lower down on which the feet were nailed. At the site of execution, by law, the victim was given a bitter drink of wine mixed with gall as a mild analgesic. The criminal was then thrown to the ground on his back with his arms outstretched. The hands could then be nailed or tied to the crossbar, but nailing apparently was the preferred method by the Romans. Archaeological evidence of bones found dated around that time indicate that the nails used were spikes approximately 5 to 7 inches in length and approximately 3/8 an inch in diameter. About that big. Further, other ossuary findings, these are bone boxes where after people have died and passed away and their remains have rotted, the bones are oftentimes gathered and put in a small little chest or an ossuary. Those findings have also shown that the nails that are used during this crucifixion process were not driven through the palm of the hands because there wasn't enough there to hold the body up on the tree. So they were driven through the wrist, down lower, where they could purchase and hold the body up and not tear through. After the arms were fixed to the crossbar, the patibulum was then raised up with the victim on it to the stipes. Next, the feet were fixed on the cross, again, by nails or ropes. Romans preferred nails. It was quick and easy. Although the feet could be fixed to the sides of the cross, they often were nailed directly on top of one another with a large spike driven through from the top to the bottom. You guys might recognize that. It's a representation of the Shroud of Turin. It's believed by some to be the burial cloth of Jesus. Most likely not, but we're not going to get into that tonight. This was discovered in the late 1300s in Italy. Interesting thing is it shows this victim, whoever it may have been, with wounds consistent with crucifixion in the arms, in the wrists, in the side, in the feet. When the nailing was completed, the titulus or signboard was then attached to the cross, usually just above the victim's head. Sometimes it was actually hung with a string around the victim's head. The soldiers, the crowd then often taunted and jeered the condemned man, and the soldiers would then customarily divide up the clothing among themselves. The length of survival generally ranged from 3 or 4 hours to 3 or 4 days. Appeared that how long someone would last was directly related to the severity of their scourging. Someone who got off with a light scourging, if there is such a thing, may last days on the cross. We know from the record Christ was on the cross 3 to 6 hours. If the Romans, after the scourging, if it had been mild, the Romans wanted to get along with the crucifixion and get it over with, we know what they did. They broke the legs of the victim so the victim could not hold himself up any longer. He would fall down and suffocate. Not uncommonly, insects would land upon or burrow into the open wounds, or the eyes, the ears, the nose of the dying and helpless victim. Birds of prey would tear at these sites. It was actually customary to leave the corpse hanging on the cross for days to be devoured by predatory animals. However, by Roman law, the family of the condemned, if there was family that would claim him, could obtain the body. Since no one was intended to survive crucifixions, the body was not released to the family until the soldiers were sure that the victim was dead. And again, by custom, one of the Roman guards would usually pierce the body with a sword or a lance. This is thought to be a long spear that most Roman soldiers would have been taught how to work. That could be something easily reaching up 4 or 5 feet to the victim on the cross. After his scourging and mocking, at about 9 a.m., the Roman soldiers put Jesus' clothes back on him, and they then led him and two thieves out to be crucified. Ordinarily, those convicted would be forced to carry or drag their own cross to the place of execution. That would further compound their humiliation, their suffering, while the crowd watched. In his case, Jesus apparently was so weakened by the severe flogging that he could not carry his cross from the praetorium to the site of crucifixion, estimated to be no more than about a third of a mile. So the Romans were told, summoned, or called on a man. We know his name, don't we? Simon of Cyrene. To carry Christ's cross. And then that processional began, making its way to Golgotha. Golgotha is an Aramaic word meaning the skull. That was an established crucifixion site. And a couple pictures that I took while we were there in Jerusalem visiting. Doesn't look like much but a hillside by a garbage dump. If you zoom in a little closer, some have said this resembles a skull with eyes and a nose and a mouth. Once they arrived at Calvary, Jesus' clothes, except for a linen loincloth, again were removed, thereby likely reopening some of the scourging wounds. He was then offered a drink of wine mixed with myrrh or gall, but after tasting it, we're told that he refused the drink. Finally, Jesus and the two thieves were crucified. In Mark's gospel, all we are told is they crucified him and divided his garments among them. Luke's account reads, when they came to the place that is called the skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. The titulus or sign bearing his name was then attached above or hung around Jesus' head, stating, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And many believe that was a further attempt by Pilate to mock the Jews. If this is your king, I just killed him. The soldiers and the crowd taunted Jesus throughout the crucifixion ordeal. The soldiers cast lots for his clothing. Jesus hung on the cross, as I said earlier, for roughly 6 hours. We're told in the Gospels that Christ spoke 7 times while hanging on the cross. And those were very short, difficult, terse utterances, given the effects that crucifixion has on one's ability to breathe and to speak. At around noon, the 6th hour, we are told in Mark's gospel that there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day. This was not an eclipse. This was supernatural darkness. Passover occurred during a full moon, and a solar eclipse can only occur during a new moon. This was God in control of all. At about 3 p.m., the 9th hour that Friday, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was offered another drink. Then he said, "It is finished." Jesus then gave up his spirit. And the emphasis there is on gave up. He, in effect, handed over his spirit as an act of his own will. No one took his life from him. Rather, he voluntarily and willingly, in submission to the will of the Father, gave up his life. Jesus then bowed his head and he died. We read that the curtain of the temple, which separated the Holy of Holies, was torn in two at that exact time, signifying that the way to God's presence was now opened by the death of his Son. The Roman soldiers and onlookers recognized this moment of his death. We recall the centurion saying, "Certainly this man was the Son of God." Matthew's gospel mentions a great earthquake, tombs opening, saints being risen from the dead, going into the city and appearing to many people. All these supernatural events occurring at this time. Again, since the Jews did not want the bodies to remain on the cross after sunset, the beginning of Sabbath, they asked Pontius Pilate to order the breaking of the legs to hasten the deaths of these three men. John's gospel tells us that the soldiers broke the legs of the two thieves, but when they came to Jesus, they didn't need to because he was already dead. But just to make sure, one of the soldiers, we're told, pierced Jesus' side, again with one of those long infantry spears, and we're told in John chapter 19 that it produced a sudden flow of blood and water. Sometime shortly thereafter, we know that Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, placed in a tomb. Jesus' death, after only 3 to 6 hours on the cross, surprised even Pontius Pilate. The fact that Jesus cried out in a loud voice and then bowed his head and died suggests even the possibility of a catastrophic terminal event, such as a rupture of an aortic aneurysm or sudden cardiac arrest. However, another explanation may be more likely. Jesus' death may have been hastened simply by his utter state of exhaustion and by the unusual severity of the scourging that he was put through, with significant blood loss and being in a state of shock. The fact that he couldn't even carry his own cross again supports that. The actual cause of Jesus' death, like that of other crucified victims, may have been multifactorial, could be related to loss of blood or hypovolemic shock, exhaustion, asphyxia, which basically for a crucified man is when you cannot hold yourself up and breathe any longer and you choke to death. Thus, from a medical standpoint, it remains unsettled whether Jesus actually died of cardiac rupture or of cardiorespiratory failure. However, the important feature may be not how he died, but rather whether he died. There are many false religions out there that teach that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that the Romans confused and put somebody else on the cross, or that he was crucified but wasn't killed. I think we can conclude that it's with both medical and biblical certainty. We know that Christ died on the cross at Calvary. He was laid in a tomb with nail wounds in his hands and feet, and still possessed those scars following his resurrection. The extreme physical insults to Christ's body left him ragged, torn, bleeding, and tormented with pain. Yet, he endured willingly all the agony, all the suffering of the cross for each one of us. All this was not thrust upon or forced on Jesus. All this occurred according to the divine will and plan of God. And in the end, Christ willingly and lovingly gave up his life in obedience to the will of his heavenly Father, that through the death of his perfect Son, he would pay the price of our sins for all who would believe in and on his name. Praise be to God.
If you would stand with us once again.